Okay, so we're going to take a look at the yellow wallpaper, delve into it a little bit with some close reading so that you can get an understanding onto how you can approach your paper. So, okay. There has been multiple readings and interpretations on this story, and in order to really understand what a story is about, what you need to do is look closely at the text, that propinquity that we had talked about earlier. You need to see what phrases stand out, where there might be repetitions or patterns or an evolution of a way a character is thinking or seeing things. So first, let's look at the story here in the very beginning. There's there's one thing that stands out very clearly to me. If you look at the line, John is a physician, and perhaps I would say, not say it to a living soul, of course, but this is a dead paper and a great relief to my mind. Perhaps that is one reason I do not get well faster. You see, he does not believe I am sick, and what can one do? And that question, it just seems like an innocuous question at that point, but just a few lines later where she says, personally, I disagree with their ideas. Personally, I believe that congenial work with excitement and change would do me some good, but what is one to do? So that what is one to do that appears twice very quickly gives us very strong into that character and what's going on with this story. It answers the question, it dramatizes the wife's subconscious way of dealing with a situation that her conscious self cannot fully acknowledge. What is one to do means that she has no power, she has no agency in this situation. So what does she do? That's what the story is all about. That's what the story tells us. She does two things. She secretly and slyly writes to us, the reader, and tells us about this situation. And the other thing that she does is she finds a woman who's trapped in the wallpaper and she helps that woman get out. Those are the two things that she does. That's her way of taking agency and answering that question, what is one to do? She tells us. Okay, so also to more fully get involved in this story, here are some questions that I put together that you might want to consider. Well, first, what are the effects and significance of the point of view? Describe how the narrative situation is integral to the story. What does the narrator think about writing? And does the main character change with regard to how she thinks of herself? If you keep those questions in mind while you read the story again, it'll give you some deeper insight. Also, you might want to look at the significance of the setting, how the house is described, the room. The room that she stays in is considered a nursery, which is kind of strange because there's scratches on the floors, there's scratches on the bed. The bed is nailed down, there's bars on the window. If you have ever read the story Jane Eyre, it corresponds to the concept of mad woman in the attic, which is what a lot of people had to do with women, and women often went insane during the 19th century, and they would house them in rooms that had bars and that were on top floors, sometimes cut off from everybody in the house. They would enclose them in and have to do things like nail down the bed and lock the door. So perhaps it wasn't a nursery. Perhaps it was a place where in an earlier time another woman had been, or another person had been in that room. So also, how is the husband portrayed? So here's where we get into gender a little bit. How does the woman see him? How does the husband see her and treat her? Does their understanding of each other change? You know, it's funny in the very beginning, I can go back to this page right here. It says that the first line here, John laughs at me. Well, of course, that one can expect that in a marriage. No, one actually doesn't expect that in a marriage, but she takes that as something that's expected. We also learn about John here by she tells us that he's practical in the extreme. He has no patience with faith, and he has an intense horror of superstition. He scoffs openly at any talk of things not to be felt and seen and put down in figures. So that characterizes the man's practical nature as compared to the woman's emotional and his more hysterical nature. So a fourth question would be looking at the objects or colors that might be significant. The color yellow, obviously it's in the title, it stands out. What does that mean? Could that be a symbol for? You can do some research on that. And does the symbolism change throughout the story? And I had mentioned earlier the concept of irony. Irony is at the heart of the conflict here, and that conflict is between her and John, in which she sees John and talks about John as loving, and in the next sentence talks about how she has to hide things from him. So look at those types of things as you go back through the story, and I think you'll get some deeper insight. Now I wanted to look at a little bit more closer. Here's some of the irony things. I can actually do this with you right now. This is how these stand out. I get unreasonably angry with John sometimes. I'm sure I never used to be so sensitive. I think it's due to this nervous condition. What's interesting is that she perceives her situation as one of unreasonable anger, but she's very reasonable throughout the entire story. She's practical, she's pragmatic, and she's logical. Now, another case, she says, "Dear John, he loves me very dearly and hates to have me sick. I tried to have a real earnest, reasonable talk with him the other day." Well, the dramatic irony there is that John's actions completely contradict her perception of him as loving. John is not earnest or reasonable with Jane. Well, Jane, that's another thing we need to talk about. At the very end of the story, she talks about Jane referencing herself. Sometimes that's considered her name. Other times it's considered a slip. Perhaps Charlotte Perkins Gilman got it wrong and was talking about Jenny. Or Jane could also be a reference to Mad Woman in the Attic and Jane Eyre. But for all practical purposes, I prefer to call the narrator Charlotte, even though it's the author's name, because it isn't given one. But we can also look at it as Jane. And here's another case of irony. John is not able to see the goal of his system of treatment to make her well, which contradicts the actual meaning of what he is intending to do, and he's making her sicker. The wife's not able to see the nature of her situation and her own superior understanding of it. She's the one who sees that she doesn't know what to do and doesn't have agency. And therefore, the apparent meaning of the wallpaper to her disordered imagination conflicts with the real meaning that she is the one that is the imprisoned woman. So now let's look at the wallpaper and how the wallpaper figures into the story. We can actually trace the development of her relationship with the wallpaper. When she first encounters the wallpaper, she is repulsed. She says she's shut up in a summer home in the bedroom she doesn't like. It's smoldering, unclean yellow, and it has a way of breaking into sprawling, flamboyant patterns. The wallpaper she calls outrageous, and it's unheard of contradictions. The second time she encounters the wallpaper, or at least describes it to us, she talks about it as having an intention. She says, "The paper looks to me as if it knew what a vicious influence it had." So the viciousness perhaps revealed in a pattern which lolls like the broken neck and two bulbous eyes stare at you upside down. She's also noticing a sub-pattern or a figure skulking behind the front design, but by giving the intention to the wallpaper, she's starting to personify it and give it human-like qualities. The third time is, as we evolve through the story, she actually develops an obsession with it. She says, "I used to get more entertainment and terror out of blank walls and plain furniture than most children found in a toy store." And then she's doing the same thing now. She has a habit of story making. She says she fancies that people are walking. She believes that the woman trapped in the wallpaper gets out because she can see her creeping in the lanes, the long road in the garden, through every one of my windows. Further development of her relationship with the wallpaper is that she starts to get an appreciation for it. She says, "I'm getting really fond of the room in spite of the wallpaper," and immediately switches to perhaps because of the wallpaper. So there's a fondness that's starting to develop. Then she makes discoveries of things through the wallpaper. She says the outside pattern is holding a prisoner. Behind the outside pattern, there are dim shapes get clearer every day, and the shape is like a woman stooping down and creeping about behind the pattern. So this is her getting closer in touch with her own subconscious. If the paper represents a woman who is imprisoned, and that's what she is, but doesn't recognize it consciously, then this is a melding of her consciousness and her subconsciousness. She sees the imprisonment. The moonlight makes the pattern into bars. It slaps you in the face. It knocks you down. It tramples upon you. It's like a bad dream. Her subconscious is becoming more conscious to her. Then she actually identifies with the woman. The woman who creeps behind the wallpaper is described in increasing detail. The focus becomes on the woman's possible escape now. And at one point, the narrator uses the phrase I. She switches really quickly from the woman, I creep. She's both herself and the creeping woman. She has a split perception. And then she decides to free the other woman by tearing off the wallpaper. Now she herself becomes that outsider. She says, Jane can't keep me in. We don't know here who Jane is. Does she mean Jenny? Does she mean Jane as herself? Is that her name? Or Jane, is that a symbolic name for a mad woman? Then I says, I suppose I shall have to get back behind the pattern when it comes night, and that is hard. It is so pleasant to be out in this great room and creep around as I please. Here she has become the woman in the wallpaper, upon which she needs to make her final escape. And that's when John falls unconscious across his wife's path. He no longer blocks her way. Calmly and repeatedly, she crawls over him who is laid out on the floor. I've got out at last, said I, in spite of you and Jane, again a reference to Jane, we don't know who that is. And I've pulled off most of the wallpaper, so you can't put me back. Now, she asks this question, why should that man have fainted? But he did, and right across my path by the wall, so that I had to creep over him every time. Becoming one with her subconscious has allowed her to be the woman in the wallpaper that she perceived as trapped, and then to escape. And it's ironic here that her clarity of mind that she gets at the end and her subconsciousness as it has surfaced has actually manifested itself as insanity.